Hello, you've tuned into State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal South Asian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nayantara Narayanan. Before we go further, here's a reminder to check out all of Himal's podcasts on the Himal South Asian podcast channel on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. You can listen to our new podcast series, Partitions of the Heart, Conversations with Harsh Mandar. Season 1 is out now, in which he speaks with eminent and emerging voices on the crisis of Muslims in India. This week, we mark 50 years since Indira Gandhi declared emergency in India, a period that has been called the darkest in India's democracy. Today, I'm joined by Christophe Jaffrelot, a distinguished scholar of South Asia who holds positions at Sciences Po and King's College, teaching South Asian politics and history. He's the author of several detailed and expansive books on South Asia. In his book, India's First Dictatorship, The Emergency 1975 to 1977, which he authored with his student Pratinav Anil, he examined the emergency meticulously to provide a comprehensive account as well as to expose fundamental weaknesses in India's political and constitutional systems. India has been called the largest democracy, an improbable democracy, and a beacon of democracy in the global south, and especially in South Asia, where there have been very different experiences in other nation states. But this book shows that India was really a tenuous democracy. And why we are discussing this book and the emergency today, 50 years after the event, is that this democracy continues to be tenuous, and we also compare the social politics at the time of the emergency to the present. So, Christophe, thank you so much for being here today to talk about all of this with us.
Thank you for your invitation.
Indira Gandhi declared the emergency on 25th June 1975. At the time, there was economic stagnation, pervasive corruption, social unrest, and political upheaval. The politician and activist Jayaprakash Narayan was leading this movement, calling for a total revolution that included, of course, removing Indira Gandhi as Prime Minister. Can you tell us more about the social and political conditions in India at the time that led to the imposition of the emergency, and also the perception of Indira Gandhi within the political class and among the people of India at the time?
Yes, you need to look at the context indeed. And for understanding this context, you need to go back to at least 1969. Because 69 is the year when Indira Gandhi split the Congress party. She had inherited from her father in the first place, a party that was rather schizophrenic. You had at the top secular, progressive leaders, Nehru himself, of course, in the first place. But you had at the state level party bosses who were much more conservative. And when Nehru left the scene and died in 1964, they took over power to a great extent, forming what was known as the syndicate. And they picked up Indira at that time. Well, not exactly after Nehru's death, because there was, of course, an interim period. But by 66, she was their creature, and they thought that she would be easily manageable. They were conservative, they were all men, and she emancipated herself from this group, breaking the Congress into two parts, at least. The Congress O, that was for the organization that these people retained, and what was the Congress R, that was for requisitionists, but also for ruling, because she was at the helm of this Congress R, and she continued to rule. She dissolved the parliament, the assembly, and that was the moment in the 70s, early 70s, 70, 71, when she really transformed Indian politics under Congress. And that prepared the ground for the emergency from one very important point of view. She had initiated a new style, you can say a populist style of politics. She was a leftist, a left populist. At the same time, you had Zulfikar Ali Bhutto doing the same thing in Pakistan. You had the Bandaranaike case doing the same thing in Sri Lanka. A leader stood against the conservatives and claimed that he or she represented the people. And she accumulated a lot of power within Congress, something Nehru himself never had, because Nehru precisely had to negotiate with all these party bosses. She emancipated herself from the party apparatus, from the state leaders. In fact, she appointed chief ministers. It was a very potentially authoritarian regime. So the opposition, of course, regrouped against her, and you had a large coalition from the socialist to the Hindu nationalist of the Jan Sangh, because she had to be dislodged from power. Everyone had to join hands against her. And that's exactly what the JP movement was about. So you had in the street a mass mobilization regrouping all the opposition forces against her. And she was the towering figure of the ruling party. So the polarization was maximum. And the main reason why people were in the street was corruption. In Bihar, especially in Gujarat, these two states were the places where, after 73, you had a huge mobilization among students, especially. And finally, this confrontation that was very personal. It's prepared the ground for the emergency, because she realized that they really wanted her to go. And when she had to resist, she accumulated even more power. She had Sanjay Gandhi at that time, her second son, becoming her only or most influential advisor, which was certainly a turning point also, because he gave very bad pieces of advice. So this is, if you want, what explains the emergency. This is the context. And then you had, of course, the decision of the Supreme Court of India. That was so important. In 1971, during the Lok Sabha elections, she had used some material from the state for her campaign, and one of her advisors was still part of the administration. So these two things made her situation complicated. It was a case of corruption, and the Supreme Court in June did not dismiss her, but she was asked to stop attending parliamentary session. She was in a way suspended, and back to the wall with the opposition in the street, she decided to go for the emergency.
You described the emergency as post-colonial India's first experiment with authoritarianism, but there are different kinds of authoritarianisms as well. What kind was this in terms of, the policies that we saw over those 18 months? Indira Gandhi's 20-point plan, but what really happened on the ground, Sanjay Gandhi's 5-point plan, and what happened on the ground. How would you describe it?
It's a complete kaleidoscope. The emergency is a very strange moment with so many contradictory trends. Of course, the number one target is the opposition. So she has arrested 100,000 people, political leaders, political cadres, trade unionists, all the opposition leaders are behind bars, including JP, including all the Jansang leaders, Advani, Vajpayee, including the socialist George Fernandez, of course the Charan Singh people, Charan Singh himself, the Kisan, the peasant leader. So that's the first thing she did in the night of the 25th of June, arrest so many people. Number two, in the same vein, censorship of the media. And most of the newspapers will fall in line, sometimes very reluctantly. Some of them will try to resist. This is the heydays of the Indian Express. The subtitle of the newspaper, Journalism of Courage, comes from that period, but most of the other newspapers fell in line. Then you have a very vertical line of command, a concentration of power in the hands of a duo, Indira Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi. Most of the ministers are short-circuited. She replaces some of them. Gujral is sent as ambassador to Moscow. He is replaced as the IB, Information and Broadcasting Minister, by VC Shukla. So a concentration of power that is, of course, a symptom of this authoritarianism. And when Sanjay asserts himself, he has some obsessions. Two of them deserve to be somewhat scrutinized. One was, of course, the demographics. The growth of the population was seen as a real disaster for India. By the way, in the context of the assessment of the rest of the world at that time, the World Bank and many organizations are really worried about India's demographic trends. Anyway, they decided, Sanjay in the first place, to sterilize people massively. And 8 million people finally will be more or less forcibly sterilized during the emergency. That was one of the symptoms or expressions, if you want, of this authoritarianism. Another one, of course, is and that's again an obsession that we find in Sanjay, the beautification of cities. Slums had to go. So Kashmiri Gate in Delhi, for instance, was clean or made clean after a military or paramilitary intervention, and people were rehabilitated in the suburbs of Delhi. Incidentally, on both counts, sterilization and rehabilitation, quote unquote, Muslims were the first targets because they were supposed to have more children, and they lived in slums. They were overrepresented in slums. So many of the violent interventions of the police took place in Muslim neighborhood, including the Jama Masjid neighborhood in Delhi. That's the authoritarian bit, more than a bit. This is really the authoritarian face of the emergency. Now you have something that contradicts that to some extent. It is made in the name of the people. She claims that she had to impose the emergency for serving the people against reactionary forces, against the legacy of the syndicate, against the leaders who wanted to get rid of her, including Morarji Desai, Charan Singh, the Jansang RSS people. She targeted the RSS, saying they are all playing in the hands of the RSS, which was partly true, because the RSS was, of course, the force behind the JP movement to a large extent. So she said, I'm doing all that for you, for the people. And that's what the 20-point program is about. It's about land reform. It's about more rights for the downtrodden. It's populist, again, it's populism of the left. But when you look at the outcome, it has not brought results. The land reform is very limited. And in the industrial sector, in the urban part of the country, on the contrary, she really bought to the business milieu. She was pro-business. So you can have a very I would say again a negative assessment of that facet of the emergency. And the last facet I would like to mention, because it's also a way to characterize the complexity of the emergency. Well, the constitution has been amended, yes. Elections have been delayed, but there is a parliament. The parliament is functioning. You have members of parliament of all the parties who sit and debate and vote. And it's very strange to see, for instance, Jan Sanghi's socialists making the parliament function. Similarly, you have a Supreme Court that is not systematically bowing to Mrs. Gandhi's diktat. Most of the time, yes, they have no courage. But some members of this court stand and oppose. Justice Khanna, for instance, had the courage to defend the habeas corpus, and she loses a couple of on a couple of issues in the judiciary. Plus this resistance that you see in the street, the Akali Dal people in Punjab resisting air domination, also air ally, the CPI, Communist Party of India. It's part of the coalition led by Mrs. Gandhi. But Indrajit Gupta and others can object and criticize and oppose. So it's not as if the old parliamentary life, the old democracy had been completely erased. It's more complicated. It's much more nuanced.
And this is what you show so much in the book, that it was a very complex phenomenon, full of contradiction, but that it also allowed, I think, different parties and interests to adopt different narratives of the emergency over 50 years. And perhaps, a couple of things that we've forgotten along the way, that again you bring back in this book, is the nature of resistance, that it wasn't really as much as we like to believe, as narratives have portrayed that there was this great resistance against Indira Gandhi and the emergency. And the second one is the role of corporates and the sort of crony capitalism at the time. To tackle the first one first, what would you say about, where were the pockets? And they were really pockets of resistance. It wasn't a mass resistance. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, very few people indeed had the courage to resist. You understand, by the way, you understand today's India better. And that's why I did this book, incidentally. When you see what happened during the emergency, very few people had the courage to resist. Pockets, as you say. The socialists had their own network. George Fernandez was underground and had his own network of people. They were responsible for sabotage. They had this connection with the railways main union, and it helped, of course. They were responsible for the Baroda case as well. They accumulated some explosives, and finally they were all caught and tortured. Some of them died in jail. Torture was very much used against those who resisted. So that's one group, the socialists. Then, of course, you have the Hindu nationalists. Again, many people went underground. RSS people were used to go underground. Some of them remembered what it was to be underground in the previous decades. For the oldest ones, the 1948, the post-Mahatma Gandhi's assassination ban of RSS had led some of them to go underground, and they knew how to do it. They were very effective. Narendra Modi went underground in Gujarat, for instance. This is also a moment that is important for the Hindu nationalists, because underground they needed support, and they found some of this support in the diaspora and the Gujarati diaspora in the first place. Another man who played a role there was Subramaniam Swamy, who was, of course, with some American connection. He had been to Harvard for his studies. So that's another very important group. The RSS certainly increased its influence over society, partly because of this. And the third group is made of the Akalis. When you look at who had the guts to demonstrate, to fight openly in the street, the number one group is made of the Akalis in Punjab. And thousands of them went to jail, literally. This is a fascinating example of the sense of resistance, this stamina. But pockets, again, you can't say there was a national movement of resistance. No, it was very scattered. It was very limited. Most of the people adjusted to the situation. The few bureaucrats, the few lawyers who tried to resist Mrs. Gandhi and Sanjay, Nariman, Subramaniam, IAS officers, or when they tried to do that, they were boycotted by the others. Nobody wanted to talk to them anymore. They were ostracized. And it speaks volume of how courageous people were.
And even the RSS, again, they have this big narrative that they resisted. And certainly they were against the emergency and they wanted Indira Gandhi out. But it wasn't from the motive of upholding democratic or constitutional values, was it?
No, exactly. That's a very interesting point. In fact, Devras, Babasaheb Devras, wrote two letters to Mrs. Gandhi saying, please lift the ban on us and we'll support you. The big problem for RSS always is if you're banned, you don't exist at all anymore. You can't achieve your mission. And the mission is to organize the Hindus. The mission is to be in the field, doing the daily routine of Shaka organizations and so on. So they wanted the ban to be lifted at any cost.
Right.
And we're prepared indeed to support her because, yes, they were not so much against this kind of authoritarian rule. And after the emergency, there was an interesting book that was prefaced by Tangari, Daropan Tangari, who was a very important RSS leader. He was the founder of the BMS, the trade union of RSS. He said in this book, now it's time to revisit Indian democracy, not to restore Indian democracy. Something more Indian has to be built. So they did not want to go to the status quo ante. In fact, they never appreciated the secular character of the Indian of the Indian constitution in the first place. And you mentioned the business milieu, and that's a very important point indeed. The emergency is probably the turning point we have missed in terms of the undoing of Indian socialism. Nehru had introduced this Nehruvian system, as it is called retrospectively. Of course, it was not known as a Nehruvian system at that time, but he wanted a socialist-like society. This is exactly the word he used. And for that, the state had to play a big role. The planning commission had to play a major role. And everything was regulated. It was a license Raj. Any investment by a private company had to be cleared by the planning commission. You wanted to expand your production. You wanted to diversify your production. You could not do it without the clearance of the state. The business community, of course, was very much against this system, and the Bombay Club, especially Tata in the first place, J.R.D. Tata in the first place, but of course the Birlas tried to resist that, and they tried to resist that by supporting the Swatantra Party in the first place in the 60s. But in 75, Indira turned to them and finally agreed that some relaxation of the license Raj would be a good idea. Again, somewhat under the influence of Sanjay. Sanjay was fascinated by the Singaporean story, development, an authoritarian mode of development where the private sector plays a leading role at the expense of the state. And it combines authoritarianism on the political scene and, if you want, privatization of the economy, and both had to work together. Well, indeed, both did play together, and this is probably the first moment when we see crony capitalism crystallizing in India, and the relation between Indira Gandhi and Dhirubhai Ambani probably gives the first instance of what it is to have oligarchs in India. At least one oligarch was born at that time.
Okay, before we continue with this conversation, a quick reminder to our listeners, Himal brings you cross-border stories that you won't find anywhere else. It takes a lot to do this kind of in-depth, independent journalism, and we rely on listeners like you. You can support the magazine by becoming a paying patron. Click on the link in the episode notes, or go to our website himalmag.com and click Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. Now back to our conversation with Christophe Jaffrelot. Christophe, what are the parallels with that, that initial instance of crony capitalism with what's happening now in India? Modi's relationship with the Ambanis and Adani. Do you see parallels? Is it a continuation of what happened in 1975? How do you draw out that story?
Yes, no, there are certainly parallels, because Dhirubhai Ambani and then Mukesh subsequently were certainly very close to the ruling party and to the rulers personally. In fact, the Ambanis gave money to Indira. And when she died, by the way, there was an anecdote. Rajiv was told, "Oh, your mother received a lot of money from us. Now we need to talk and see what can be done." So that's certainly a model that we see today with this duo, the Adani-Modi duo. Mm-hmm. Incidentally, it's not so new if you go back to history and look at this amazing relationship between G.D. Birla and Mahatma Gandhi. The fact that a big businessman had no inhibition in financing a politician because Mahatma Gandhi was a politician, at least in the 20s and 30s. So that's a kind of patronage relationship that was there before. The big boss, the moneyed one, the crowparty, making politics possible, some kind of politics possible, and of course getting something in return. Now the situation today is, of course, very different because of the magnitude of the phenomenon. Mr. Ambani could not dictate air terms to Indira Gandhi. No way. And the margin for maneuver was very limited because the state remained very strong. Till 1991, till the reform that Manmohan Singh orchestrated, the private sector was a prisoner of the license Raj, could not do much on its own. Today, it's a very different story. And it's a very different story because the privatization of the state has been so all-pervasive. In the first place, you have these ACZs, special economic zones. The first ACZ Narendra Modi gave to Gautam Adani in 2003, the Mundra port, made it possible for Adani to be at the helm of the largest Indian port in 15 years, from 0 to number 1. And secondly, you have the privatization of airports, of ports. If there is one airport that is privatized, it is from Mr. Adani today. And he has already 6 of these airports. So the magnitude of this is different. And last but not least, Gautam Adani is a kind of ambassador for India. When he invests in coal mines in Australia, when he creates a thermal plant in Bangladesh or in Sri Lanka, when he creates a port, a deep sea port in Haifa in Israel, it's all in the name of India, and Narendra Modi has prepared the ground for the deal to take place. So it's a different game. The symbiosis, the osmosis between private capital and the Indian state, between one man at the helm of a real empire now and the Prime Minister of India, that's completely unprecedented, and it's a different model, therefore. It's really the model of the oligarchs. This is the model we saw in the first place in Russia, but we see it in many places, including Hungary today.
The other thing, of course, is how did the emergency, those 18 months, change the Congress and by extension, India's politics?
Yeah, Congress never fully recovered from the emergency. First of all, party democracy could not be revived. The last elections, party elections, which took place in the Congress was 72. And then you had to wait for Rahul Gandhi organizing one just after his yatra. So there was a long gap. Yes, because the style of leadership that Indira Gandhi had introduced as early as the 70s, but even more, of course, during the emergency, remained. She continued to dominate. And this is, of course, very puzzling. How could she get away with it? But in 1980, she's back, and she's the same. And Sanjay is back, and he's her number 2. This is something you can't really understand if you don't understand that this is not a proper democracy, in the sense that accountability is not part of the game. This is a problem in Southasia at large.
Yeah,
accountability is always missing, and political families, politicians get away with it. So Congress has remained a very vertical pyramid. Sanjay will die 6 months later, and that will contribute to re-democratize somewhat the Congress party, but not fully. And even when Rajiv takes over after her mother is assassinated in 1984, you have a very vertical modus operandi. And you have to wait for, you have to wait for the UPA coalition winning the 2004 elections for having a different modus operandi. Congress is only a primus inter pares. Manmohan Singh, Sonia Gandhi are much more collegial, but Congress is weak. And therefore, I really think that Congress could never recover fully because either it was a rather authoritarian vertical party or only a primus inter pares in a larger coalition. What it is today. This is what we see today. The other thing that was not really taken care of is, if you want, the socialist or socialist-like orientation of the regime. And that was gone after the emergency because of the private sector's assertiveness, because of the fact that by then everybody gave up on the land reform. Land reform was not on any agenda after the emergency. And that was the moment when it could have happened. It could have happened at that time because the vote banks, the local landlords and notables could not resist. There was no election to win, so the Congress leaders could impose their views to these people, and they did not. So that's also something that the emergency somewhat foreclosed. And the other thing is, of course, is in terms of demographics, family planning was out of question after the emergency. And it's a real issue because the population growth of India has been a burden more than an asset. And we can certainly argue that the demographic dividend has not been valorized in India.
You mentioned that the Congress remains, a largely vertical party, but what about the BJP? Are there parallels between, Indira's Congress after the emergency and what's happened with the BJP over the last few years?
Definitely. Narendra Modi has two models, well, at least two models in India. One is Bal Thackeray, and he has replicated so many techniques of Bal Thackeray. In fact, he got the title Bal Thackeray used to have, Hindu Hriday Samrat, the emperor of the Hindu art. That was Bal Thackeray in the first place. So Bal Thackeray is certainly the model of Narendra Modi so far as Hindu majoritarianism is concerned. Indira is his model so far as the authoritarian populist style is concerned. There are so many similarities in the way they for instance, the way he speaks to the people. Mitron, my friends, listen to Indira's speeches. It's fascinating. She had this capacity to relate to the masses in a very similar manner. That's something you see in common. You also see in common something she initiated. When she was touring India, she always adjusted to the local culture. She dressed the way the locals dressed. She tried to speak the local language, at least few sentences. And he does the same, like a chameleon. To relate to the people even more effectively, you try to resemble them. But of course, in return, you expect them to emulate you, to imitate you. And that's why also there is a mask that you can wear and you can be like him, you can look like him. And thirdly, this use of religion, again, in a rather authoritarian manner. You may remember that Indira was called Durga after the 1971 victory against Bangladesh, and she never tried to dissuade people to compare her to Durga. She turned to Hinduism, especially after Sanjay's death. She became much more religious. She patronized some Vishwa Hindu Parishad temple in Haridwar. She used religion somewhat in a different manner, in an authoritarian manner. She was the embodiment of this principle of authority that is religion, and Modi does the same with visuals. Is seen praying during the Kumbh Mela or in a cave in the Himalayas. So that's, of course, he goes much further than her. In fact, she used religion at that time in the early 80s, but not only Hindu religion. She played also the Muslim card with Aligarh university's minority status. She played also the Sikh card to destabilize the Akali Dal, and that was a big mistake. Because she, of course, helped the Khalistanis, Sanbin Ranwale in particular. But yes, you can see there a use of religion that is something Modi is very good at, but of course he uses only one religion.
Do you also think that there are similarities in the way, I mean, you've described what they did, but there are also similarities in the way they were received and perceived by the electorate?
Definitely. Both of them have been perceived as charismatic leaders. And when we say charismatic leaders, we have to be very careful. Max Weber, the German sociologist who introduced this idea of charismatic legitimacy, does not say that the charismatic leader does good things. Of course, we think that the charismatic leader is Mahatma Gandhi, is Nelson Mandela, is Martin Luther. No, the charismatic leader is the one who does things nobody did before. Exceptional deeds. And she did exceptional things. The first nuclear test, 1974. The breaking of Pakistan with the 1971 creation of Bangladesh. The annexation of Sikkim. The emergency, that was seen as something exceptional. Wow, she did it. She put 100,000 people behind bars. It's fascinating to listen to the testimonies of those Emma Tarlow has interviewed in her book, Post-Emergency, people who have been victims of the emergency, praising Indira Gandhi as someone who had the guts. Well, you can exactly transpose the same thing to Narendra Modi. He did things nobody did before. The Gujarat pogrom, the Balakot attack against Pakistan, the demonetization 2016. Wow, he did it. And this is so characteristic of authoritarian personalities with a populist angle, because they are popular. They are fascinating.
Right. That brings us again to the question of accountability that you had raised earlier. As you said, Indira came back in 1980, also with a huge margin. The thing that occurs to me is after the absolute disaster that was COVID in India, Modi comes back in 2024, maybe with not as much of a mandate as before, but he does come back for a third term as Prime Minister. And you've mentioned that in India there's a certain shallowness of democratic culture, this reluctance of people to hold their leaders accountable for what has happened. Where does that leave us now? And I think if I could just ask in terms of, what were the lessons that we should have learned from the emergency that we don't seem to have learned 50 years later?
Well, the main lesson should have been the rule of law has to be strengthened. Because if you want accountability, you need a very strong rule of law. Incidentally, something you find in Latin America. Mrs. Kirchner recently, Bolsonaro probably will go to jail or will be declared ineligible because the judiciary is sufficiently independent and strong. In South Asia, the judiciary is there, but never goes that far. And the rule of law is somewhat contained. Because these leaders certainly have done illegal things, but they retain some legitimacy. And this disconnect between legitimacy and legality is very important. Because they prevail over the Constitution simply because of what they represent. They represent something bigger than the Constitution, something bigger than what should be the legal framework. And therefore, they get away with it. How can we explain this? It has something to do with the culture that religiosity fosters. You believe in things that are beyond the human creation. Humans have created a constitution, but they are not the ultimate goals, these constitutions. When someone can claim that he embodies the national culture, the national identity, for the good of the people, is above accountability. A charismatic leader is above accountability. And people believe in charisma more easily in non-secular societies, probably. I think that's one explanation. Because the resilience of traditions, the resilience of hierarchies, the resilience of prestige, it's also one of the explanations why so few people behind bars after crimes, after theft. Again, you're easily on bail when you belong to the top of society. So it's not only the religiosity, it's also the sense of status, hierarchy. Yeah, but incidentally, it's not only in South Asia. Look at the US. The Trump administration had also very badly managed COVID, but Trump is back also.
Your book came out in 2020. It's been 5 years, and things in India have been changing really fast. Are there different insights that you have now, the state of the country and the state of democracy? In 2021, the US-based nonprofit Freedom House downgraded India from a free democracy to a partially free democracy. At the same time, the Sweden-based VDEM Institute was very harsh and described India as an electoral autocracy. The Economist Intelligence Unit took India 2 places down in its index. You have described India as an ethnic democracy. Just going back to that, political commentators in India have always described the emergency as this darkest period. But now, in the present, have we been heading to someplace darker?
In a way, yes, because the emergency could be undone. And it could last only for 18 months. We missed that point. It was a very short period of time. And Indira Gandhi herself decided to lift the emergency. It was not because of resistance. It was not because of opposition. It was really because she thought two things. One, Sanjay would become unstoppable if that continued. And she knew that was not going in the right direction. She had this lucidity. And to stop him, she could ask the voters to decide the fate of the country. And two, she could not stand the image India was getting in the West because of the media, because of liberals in the West. India had been given a new kind of depiction, and she was very, very upset. So she lifted the emergency. You could undo it. It was largely undone, even though there is some legacy, but you will not be able to undo what's going on in India so easily today. First of all, it's not 18 months, it's 15 years minimum. 15 years. 15 years is a lot.
Right.
Because you erode all the alternative power centers. The media are in the hands of friends of Narendra Modi or people who don't dare to resist him. The bureaucracy has been completely refurbished, transformed, and you have only yes men now in key positions, including the election commission. The judiciary is down, not out, but down for sure. It's so easy to blackmail chief justices, so easy not to appoint justices nominated by the collegium, and therefore this court is now very docile. And of course, centralization of power at the expense of federalism is clearly affecting the balance of power we used to know, we used to see in India. And if the next elections are fought on the basis of a census that results in a redelimitation of the constituencies, the South will play a marginal role, and the South is really the place where you have alternatives. So how do you undo that?
Do you agree with the characterization of this period as an undeclared emergency, which is a term that's gotten a lot of currency in recent years?
Yeah, you can say this. You can use, I would say, another concept that is more, I would say, helpful for making comparisons with the rest of the world, because this trajectory is not unique to India. You know, this is the trajectory of so many countries. This is a case of ethnic democracy or ethnic autocracy and electoral authoritarianism. You have elections, they are less and less fair, but they are there. You can't dislodge the leaders from power because it's an uneven playing field. And citizens, some citizens are really more equal than others, to paraphrase George Orwell. And you have now second-class citizens. You know, this is something we have not mentioned yet, but it is so important to emphasize the fact that Muslims, Christians to some extent, will probably never be citizens of India the way they were 30, 40, even 20 years ago. Because even if you dislodge BJP from power, you will not remove the vigilantes from villages, from towns and cities. And they keep an eye on the minorities. Their campaigns against love jihad or land jihad or any kind of jihad is something that will continue, again, because they are legitimate. They defend Hinduism. How can you fight those who defend Hinduism?
Right. There's so much more we can talk about, so many ways we can examine the emergency. I have so many more questions for you, but I will refer our listeners to your book for all of that. What I'd like to ask you for three recommendations, these can be other books, movies, podcasts, to tell us about the emergency, or in fact, anything you'd like to recommend on the past and present of India's politics and democracy.
Yes, well, I think we have a lot of testimonies, personal testimonies, which are really interesting to read. And I would recommend one of them, the journalist who went to jail immediately after the emergency, Nayar. I have written a book, The Judgment, that I really recommend. That's great. Two, after the emergency, there was a one-man commission that was appointed, the Shah Commission. We have put online not only the final report that is very slim, but all the interrogatories of the guilty men. And I really recommend to use this source. It is safely accessible. The website address is in the book. That's a source that needs to be explored. And in terms of, because we have not mentioned that at all, in terms of the Dalits and the emergency, read The Fine Balance by Renton Mystery. And then you will see what it was to be at the receiving end at that time, when you were a slum dweller, when you were a Dalit. Fiction sometimes is even more telling than social science books, but I recommend still Emma Tallo's book that I have mentioned, because it goes together. Right. The same people described by Mystery are somewhat interviewed 10, 15 years later by Emma Tallo, and you have a different vision. They eulogize her, which is really disturbing.
That's great. Thank you for those recommendations, Christophe, and thank you so much for being here today, for taking us through all of this on the emergency and the current state of India's democracy.
Thank you.
That was Christophe Jaffrelot on the State of Southasia podcast. If you like this episode, leave us a comment or write to us at editorial@himalmag.com. Tell us what you want to hear about on this podcast. Go to our website, himalmag.com, to find more stories on politics and history in India and across South Asia. Don't forget to tune into the South Asia Review of Books podcast with Shweta Srikanthan next week. She will be in conversation with writer Vahini Vara about her new book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age, which is a personal exploration of how technology companies have both fulfilled and exploited the human desire for understanding and connection. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening, and see you then.